So now why a for-profit? Real quickly, just spitballing a couple ideas. Why do you think a for-profit as opposed to a nonprofit?
For better sustainability of the venture that we are doing.
Mm-hmm. And so for the sake of the film, so that was for the sustainability of the venture. That's true, but remember that a nonprofit, it can generate revenue as well, as long as it's related to your exempt purpose. So that one can be the case, but doesn't always apply. Anybody else? Yeah.
Isn't it cheaper to establish and then fees, and then also less people?
For the for-profit? Yeah. So it is cheaper. Depends on what aspect you're talking about. You don't have to pay taxes, and that's a big chunk of fees. But there are a lot more regulatory requirements and paperwork, and filing the tax filing that you have to do every year for a nonprofit is probably more involved than for a for-profit, which is why do I have to file a tax filing? I'm tax exempt. You have to report everything that you're doing to the IRS. Anybody else? Yeah.
Access to investors.
Yeah. So that's a really big one is access to investors. Nonprofits don't have owners. Nonprofits are run by a board of directors, and so there's individuals who are in charge of the company, but there isn't the opportunity to provide a slice of the pie to somebody who's interested in getting in on it. So that's a good one. So and all of those are actually really the reasons. So let's talk a little bit about the types of for-profits and the broad questions of which types of for-profits you would want to work within. So when you're looking at a for-profit entity, there's three kind of broad factors to consider. The first is the amount of formalities, which is what sort of meeting requirements you have, what sort of paperwork you have to file annually. The second is tax consequences, and the third is the sources of funding that may be available. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because I want to focus more on for-profit or nonprofit as opposed to the specific types of for-profit, but I'm going to run through these quickly. So under formalities, there's a spectrum of less formal to more formal, and the requirements can range from no filing requirements. So for example, if I'm an individual and just start doing business without filing any paperwork, I've created a sole proprietorship, which is a business, but it's not a formal business entity. And there's no filing requirements. I've just started doing business. There's circumstances where filing would apply, of course, but that's one. The other is the control of the enterprise. So do you want the control to be vested in one individual or in a board of directors? And then finally, things around ongoing governance. So these are the meeting requirements. So a corporation, for example, has a very rigid structure. You have owners who are called shareholders. The shareholders elect directors. The directors appoint officers, who are the president, treasurer, secretary, things like that. And you have to follow these requirements and have annual meetings every single year, even if you're the only person that fills all of those roles. So you have to write down on a piece of paper, I met with myself and appointed myself to the board of directors and appointed myself as president, treasurer, secretary, janitor, whatever. So for some people, that's really intimidating. For other people, it's I'll just set a calendar reminder and have a template document that I sign every year. So it depends on your attention to detail. So the other piece is tax. And these are the two kind of broad types of tax that apply to for-profit entities. So I don't want to get down in the weeds too much on this, but the default form for corporations is double taxation, where you have money that comes in, you have expenses that are deductible, normal business expenses, and then the entity is actually taxed. The entity itself pays taxes. And then when profits are distributed to shareholders, the shareholders are again taxed. So that's generally considered a downside of a traditional corporation. The alternative is what's called pass-through taxation. So this is an S Corp or an LLC. And there's no entity level tax. So all of the profits and losses are paid on the individual's tax returns, and the entity itself does not pay taxes. Okay? And you're probably wondering, why would anybody ever do double taxation then, right? The main reason is that there's shareholder requirements for pass-through taxation type entities that investors can often not meet. For example, you can only have natural individuals, real human beings, as shareholders in an S-corp, and investors invest through funds and through LLCs and LPs and other alphabets. So the third factor is the sources of funding available. So this kind of gets to your point, which is there's a whole range of funding that could be available to different types of for-profits that are not available to nonprofits. One thing that you'll see here is private foundations and government. I listed that under for-profit, even though those are traditionally nonprofit funding sources, but there are private foundations that invest capital, and there are government grants that are very industry specific, especially, for example, like in the health sector, where they'll go to for-profit companies. So just to give a kind of rundown of the different types of funding, there's debt and equity. Debt is things like loans. Equity is giving a piece of the pie. And so just on this kind of spectrum of risk and potential return, the debt instruments are much lower risk for investors because they're just guaranteed their interest rate, but their potential for return is a lot lower too because they're just guaranteed their interest rate. Equity, they may get nothing, or the equity may be worth a ton. So the risk goes up, but the potential return goes up. Because of that, there's also an order of payout to creditors. So if you were to dissolve, then this is the order in which payout would go. So to give you a broad picture of what an LLC is, LLCs have minimal formalities compared to corporations. I explained that with a corporation you have shareholders, directors, officers. In an LLC you can just have members, which are the owners of the business and also the decision makers of the business. You don't have annual meeting requirements, things along those lines. So it's a much more simple entity to run in terms of formalities. The tax is passed through, although you can make elections to change that if you wanted to. And then the funding is, most of these forms of funding are available, but equity investments in LLCs are much more rare. And if you're approaching institutional type investors to invest in your company, they very rarely invest in LLCs. They may from time to time, and they do from time to time, and sometimes they even require it in rare circumstances. But the general norm, especially in Silicon Valley, is to be a corporation if you want to bring on institutional investors. Oh, I'm going farther back. By contrast, a corporation has the more formal structure, which I explained. It's taxed as a double taxation, which is a downside to having a corporation. But it also opens up these other sources of funding. So in some situations, it's a necessary evil or a necessary social good if you're really into paying taxes. So the funding is much more flexible with a corporation. And just real quickly, under corporations, there's S corporations and C corporations. You may have heard of that. S corporation is a tax election, not an entity type. So both are the formal corporations. You set them up the exact same way. But if you want to elect to be taxed as an S corp, then it's a simple filing that you do on top of the basic corporation structure. And the reason you would do that is to get pass-through taxation. So a lot of small businesses do that. We are taxed as an S corp. But if you want to bring on investment capital, it won't work because of those shareholder requirements that I mentioned. They want to invest through entities. So that's to give you kind of a brief introduction into S corp versus C corp.
So my name is Hash. I'm one of the founders of SPZ, Berkeley alum both times. You know, I love the school, so I love to come back. Thanks again, Jennifer and Sophie, for having us. And thanks, Ryan, for laying the groundwork. We're going to kind of dive into what you traditionally think of as a social enterprise part of this discussion now, with a lot of the nonprofit and the for-profit background already behind us. But I'm going to follow Ryan's lead here and ask a question. Who here has heard of the benefit corporation? Okay, yeah. If you haven't, you haven't done your reading. So that was really a test for you guys. Who's heard of the B Corp certification? Everyone. Who knows the difference between the two? Okay, my job is done. Thanks. All right, I'm out of here. No, so we'll cover that. But benefit corporations, as you guys probably know, are a more recent form of entity structure that's come about. They're very popular now. Have been adopted in almost like 40 states around the country, including most notably California and Delaware, where vast majority of the corporations and businesses in the country are located. There's a whole other question of why Delaware. People are always surprised. Why would you form in Delaware? It's such a weird concept, such a small state. They've somehow carved out this niche of being the go-to state for business through protections that they have for their investors, directors, shareholders, and also through a really good bureaucracy that they've set up. But anyway, that's just in case anybody was wondering about that. But benefit corporation really came about as a reason to solve some of the problems that were existing with regular corporations. The first one being this requirement in a regular corporation that the directors of the company, the board of directors that Ryan was talking about, they have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. And that duty is to, for the most part, to look out for their interests, and in a lot of ways that means maximize their profit. So a really good example, it's sort of an old school example of this, is that back in the day, Ford, who started the Ford company, wanted to pass down some savings to its shareholders, to its customers, by reducing the cost of their cars. And their shareholders sued Ford, saying that you can't do that because that's eating into our pocketbooks. So as a result of that sort of line of cases and that sort of thinking in the law, there's this gap where a lot of newer companies don't want to be beholden to the shareholders and the shareholders' pocketbooks for the most part. They want to look beyond that. So there's more freedom for the directors in the company and the officers to kind of pursue other goals, oftentimes thought of as double or triple bottom line businesses where you focus not just on the shareholders, but also on the society, the environment, your employees, and other stakeholders in the company as well. In addition to that freedom from the traditional fiduciary duty rules, there's also a commitment internally and externally to social and environmental causes with these kinds of social enterprises. This is very important for businesses that want to bake that social mission into their DNA, saying, look, we're going to pursue profits, but we also want to make sure that anybody who works in this company or invests in the company is also committed to the same causes. And they can't just, investors can't just put money into the company and then next month change the direction of the company entirely. Or at least make it much more difficult to do that. And then finally, it's a big part of branding that's really important nowadays. It's consistent with the B Lab certification. People want to know that you're not just going to pollute the environment, and especially consumers that are millennials are going to demand for the most part that you be at least conscious of the environment and the society. So it's an important marketing tool as well. In terms of how these entities, the benefit corporation and also the social purpose corporation, which is a California type of entity, we'll talk about the difference. The way they differ, so there's in a lot of ways similar to the corporations that Ryan was talking about, right? They have the same formalities. They have shareholders. They have directors who are responsible and ultimately held accountable by the shareholders. And then you have officers, and they're taxed the same way. So you could be an S Corp, you could be a C Corp. Those things are all the same. What's different is decision-making and what the company is driven by and the mission that it has, right? So for a benefit corporation, you have to consider not just the shareholders of the company when you make any decision, but you also have to consider the environment, you have to consider society as a whole, and any other specific purpose that you build into your organization, right? So if you want to in addition to saving the environment and benefiting society, if you want to help reduce homelessness, for example, as a part of what you're doing, you can bake that into your DNA, and that's going to be in there, and nobody can change that easily. And it's going to take a lot of effort to actually overturn those kinds of things. Then you're actually judged against those missions that you set out, right? So there's an assessment process, and you have to use a third-party assessment standard. B-Lab is the organization that started and championed benefit corporations and B Corp certification. They're sort of the prominent assessment, third-party assessment standard, and they get used very frequently. And then you have to report on your ability to meet those missions and the purposes that you set out in your articles. So you have annual reporting that you have to do to your shareholders and distribute publicly, and those are an important way of making sure the company is not just saying that they're going to do something, but they actually walk the walk too. So a lot of people might have heard of the benefit corporations. Social purpose corporations are a little bit more under the radar. They're not as well known, but they're also another social enterprise that's more recently been developed. They're a little bit more lax than benefit corporations, in that they require you to consider the benefits of the shareholders that you have, but in addition to that, only the specific purposes that you lay out in your articles, right? So you're not necessarily required to consider the environment, although you could definitely do that. You're not required to consider the society as a whole, although again, you could do that. But there are specific purposes that you can list out, and those are the only things that you're held accountable for. Same thing, assessment. There is an assessment, but it's an internal assessment. So it's not really as stringent as having a third-party standard. And also reporting is a little bit more laxed as well. Now, we talked about the B-Lab certification. Oh, just one other point about social purpose corporations. As I mentioned, most states don't have that form. And that's mostly in California. So it hasn't quite gotten the same level of traction that benefit corporation has. Now, the B-Lab certification is a little bit different, somewhat overlapping and extremely confusing. So it's different from the benefit corporation in that B-Lab certification is not, or B Corp as they're called, it's not an actual entity type, it's just a certification that you get. It's kind of like the USDA certification that you have on free-range chicken that's organic. It's similar to that, but for benefit corporations. It has no legal effect, but there are certain requirements and standards that you have to meet. It's not that easy to get it. There are performance requirements, which look at your impact on the environment, how you treat your employees. You guys are already probably pretty familiar with these, but there's also legal requirements. So if you are, for example, and this is where it gets really confusing. If you're in a state that allows for the benefit corporation structure, like Delaware or California, and you want to be a corporation, you have to be a benefit corporation, assuming you're starting now. If you were kind of grandfathered in, you started out as a corporation, then you can maintain your regular corporation status. But for new corporations, you have to elect to be a benefit corporation from the start. You can also be a benefit corporation as an LLC, or as a B Corp. So again, it can get very confusing, but the point is there's a legal structure and then there's a certification. And a lot of times, from a marketing and branding perspective, that certification is really the thing that you go for. But in order to get that, you have to meet certain legal requirements to make sure that you have a demonstrated commitment to the environment, to society, and to social good. All right, so just to recap some of the things that Ryan was talking about around the reasons why you might want to form as a for-profit. If you're not organized and operating exclusively for an exempt purpose. So again, if you're doing a lot of activity that's generating revenue, but it's not directly related to your purpose, might spin that out into a for-profit company. To take on investment and to incentivize employees with equity interest. So you can't give out stock options or anything in a nonprofit. So if you want to incentivize folks with equity, you can do that in the for-profit company. And there are others as well. Like we're helping out, currently I'm helping a client who has a pretty large nonprofit, and they have a technology product and somehow it fits within the exempt purpose rules, but they wanted to commercialize the technology in a way that goes beyond what the IRS had approved. So they're developing a for-profit company, and in connection with that, they're now eligible for things like SBIR grants, which they were not eligible for as a nonprofit.